Hi, welcome to the DRH show, where I have wide-ranging conversations with fascinating people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by a professor of neuroinformatics at the University of Nottingham, Professor Marcus Kaiser. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
It's great to have you here, Professor Kaiser. If you could just start off with us telling us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Okay. I was always interested in computers and the brain, and somehow my career led to a combination of both areas. So basically, I got a home computer when I was 13, and I started to program, and I was interested in neural networks as well, and how they could explain how the brain is working. And at that time, neural networks were not working very well at all. So you couldn't do very much with neural networks. You might do some image recognition, but you can't do anything like higher cognition. So I got interested in the biology of the brain to understand more how the system is working. And I also got interested in improving brain function. So what are medical applications? So initially, I wanted to study medicine, but then I thought I need more knowledge in terms of the underlying science of the brain. So I studied biology, and I also took some modules in computer science. And then during my PhD, I looked at brain connectivity, what is now called the connectome, so how different parts of the brain are connected. I was starting with an internship at Newcastle University with Malcolm Young, looking at connectivity in brains where we had some information how they are connected. And at that time, that was connectivity in the rat, in the cat, and in the rhesus monkey. So we didn't have any information about how the human brain is connected. But then later on, we have now lots of information how the brain is connected. So I'm now very interested in applying computer simulations and computational analysis to help with diagnosis of brain diseases, and to also help to inform interventions for brain diseases based on how the human brain is connected.
It's really a fascinating background what you've got. You told me that you have a background in computer. You had your first computer when you were 13. So a lot of people would probably understand what neuroinformatics is. But my rough understanding, based from what you said, is that it's like the computer science and psychology, mental health meshed together. Is that what neuroinformatics is? And if I get it wrong, could you just tell us what neuroinformatics is and what sort of application can we get out of this field?
Yes. So it's basically the mix of neuroscience and informatics or computer science. And there has been a need to establish this field. So there were some early initiatives in the US, and then there was an OECD report in 2002 aiming for the establishment of the field of neuroinformatics. So the area deals with data storage, data annotation, data analysis, but also computational models of the brain of neural systems. And recently about machine learning and deep learning, for example. And this area has become more important because there is more and more data available. So in the olden days, maybe 30, 40 years ago, you would stick one electrode into the brain and you would record activity in the brain. Nowadays, you have setups with 20,000 electrodes. And you also have setups where you can record for a very long time. So one example is an implant for epilepsy patients, where you basically have some recordings of the system for a whole year. So you have a lot larger data sets. And of course, you also have larger data sets because of neuroimaging, MRI in the hospital, for example. So all those data sets need to be stored, annotated, and analyzed in order to inform diagnosis and treatment of patients.
But of course, Professor Kaiser, behind those sophisticated tools that you're using within your work, I understand that one of the overarching goal is to promote healthy brain development. So based from your work and the research that you've carried out, can you give us some examples of how actually your field of neuroinformatics, how it contributes to positive mental health and psychological well-being?
Yes. So basically, if you look at brain development, there have been early computer models of how the brain is developing. But we now have the opportunity to really compare computer models with actual brain development. There is developing a Connectome project that is measuring how the brain is connected in newborns and even before birth. There are projects measuring connectivity in adults. There are projects measuring connectivity in elderly subjects. So there's a lot of data now available, and there are longitudinal studies, so we can measure how the brain is connected at different time points, and we can really see how the brain is changing over time. And we can then compare that with computational models. So in our research, we have a computer model looking at the later onset of dementia. So can we basically predict whether someone will get dementia in 5 to 10 years? And we're currently extending those computer models to predict the progression of dementia after the onset of the disease. So if someone is diagnosed with dementia in a hospital, what will happen in the next 3 to 5 years? And we are using information about how the brain is connected in order to inform this. And one difference that we notice is that brain development is very different from the development that we have in artificial neural networks. For artificial neural networks, you would normally start with some randomly connected network, or it's a completely connected network, and then you are changing the weights of connections in the system. But that's not how the brain is working. A lot of the development of the brain happens before we have any input or any learning. So a lot of the fiber tracks, a lot of the connections are formed before birth, before we have any clear visual or auditory input or motor learning going on. So a lot of the organization of the brain happens independent of learning later on. It happens at very early stages. And that's why it's important to get a better understanding of how the brain is developing at those stages, and also understanding the role of genetic factors in how they influence brain development. So one recent example for this is cell death. A lot of the neurons are dying at early stages of development, even before birth, and it was not clear why all those neurons are dying. So it seems a bit like a waste if half of the neurons are born and then they die later on. But we basically found that this cell death is very important to get the correct architecture of the brain. So if you don't have this cell death, you don't get the architecture we see in the human brain and that we see in different areas of the brain.
Absolutely, that's really a fascinating field, and as you've mentioned, there are really real life applications of what you're doing. And I think Professor Kaiser, we also have to mention that more recently you actually published a research about better treatment options for epilepsy. So if you could also talk about that, so we could appreciate more the kind of science that you do.
Yes. So basically, normally you would look at brain connectivity between different regions. If we think about Brodmann, you have different visual regions in the brain, area 17, 18, and 19. So you can basically look at fiber tracks that are connecting different parts of the brain. And in the past, we have already used this information to inform whether an epilepsy patient will still have seizures after epilepsy surgery or not. But in a recent paper published a few weeks ago, we looked at a different kind of connectivity. We looked at the very local level. So rather than looking, if you think about the highway system, you can look at motorways between cities, or you can look at the streets within a city. So normally you would look at the big picture, the motorways between cities, between brain regions. But in our research, we looked at the local picture of streets within brain regions. And we found that this local architecture is more informative in terms of epilepsy surgery, whether someone will still have seizures afterwards. And unfortunately, in 1/3 of the cases, the surgery doesn't work and patients still have epileptic seizures. So we are able to predict that beforehand, whether surgery works or not. And we also found that those local changes increase over time. So the longer a patient has epileptic seizures, so in terms of the number of years with seizures, the more local changes we see, and the more brain regions show those local changes.
Absolutely. And of course, when we talk about informatics, there's also a kind of related discipline, which is connectomics. So what's the area of focus of connectomics as opposed to informatics?
Yes. So basically, connectomics is very specifically about how the brain is connected as a network. And there are different kinds of connectivity. You can have structural connectivity. So those are the real physical connections between brain regions, the fiber tracts between regions, or individual axons between neurons. But we can also look at functional connectivity. So this means that two regions show a similar activity pattern over time. So you can observe the time series of activity, and if you see a very strong correlation, the activity is similar. And finally, we can look at effective connectivity. And this means that one area is influencing activity in another area. So let's say if area A becomes more active, then area B becomes more active. Or it can be in opposite ways. So if area A becomes more active, area B becomes less active. So those three types of connectivity can inform how the system is behaving. And if we just look at structural connectivity, fiber tracks between brain regions, we can already predict the age of a subject plus minus 8 years, or the IQ of a subject plus minus 4 IQ points. So just looking at the network structure without any information about brain activity, we already know something about cognitive abilities of a subject. And in the olden days, we only had post-mortem data. So we basically need to slice up the brain and try to follow fiber tracks to find out how the brain is connected. But in the 90s, there was a new technology, the fusion imaging, where we can non-invasively measure connectivity in the brain. So we put someone into an MRI scanner. It's a very fast protocol. And then we can reconstruct fiber tracks between brain regions. And because of that, we have many more data sets than we used to have. So in 2005, there was no information about the human brain. And then a couple of years later, the first papers were published about how the human brain is connected. But nowadays, we have large-scale projects, and the largest one is the UK Biobank. So this is measuring brain connectivity in 100,000 subjects within the United Kingdom. So those are really massive data sets that we can now use. And importantly, we can go back to those data sets. So if someone is getting Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease later on, we can go back to the database and see how the brain looked like 5 or 10 years before the onset of the disease. And this can help us to determine early biomarkers of later disease onset. So we might see some characteristic changes, and we can use that to have a prognosis whether someone will develop Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease later on. So we now have very large data sets that we can use and where we can analyze brain connectivity. But a lot of the ideas for network analysis were coming from other areas. So they were coming from the social sciences, for example, how they study networks, or they come from physics in terms of how you can look at dynamics in systems.
Fascinating field, and of course there's really a lot of ideas and principles behind connectomics, and it's really difficult to condense that into a few minutes of discussions. But the good thing is that you actually wrote about a book about connectomics. It's titled Changing Connectomes. But my question to you, Dr. Kaiser, is, well, when you were telling me about this particular field, is that sometimes it sounds really, really like specific field. So is your book, can it be appreciated by those who don't have a background on neuroinformatics? Who is this book aimed for? Who's your target audience?
Yes. I mean, basically, the book is aimed for anyone who's interested in how the brain is connected as a network and how the brain is changing over time. So there was an introduction into network analysis and network organization. So you will be able to understand how the brain is organized as a network, what the main features are, for example. So one example feature is that some parts of the brain are highly connected, they're network hubs. So they have many more connections than other parts of the brain. And we know that those parts of the brain are very important in broadcasting information or receiving information. The hippocampus, for example, for memory formation and memory retrieval, and the amygdala for emotional evaluation of input. So basically, there's an introduction in there about how the brain is organized as a network. There was also information in there about how this organization changes during evolution. You have simple organisms where you just have connectivity to nearby neighbors in the network. Then you have more complex organisms that are specialized. So you have different modules, one module for vision, one module for processing sound, one module for motor function, and so on. And then going up to the human brain, where you have still a more complex organization with modules within modules within modules. So you have a hierarchical organization of the system. And then the book describes different mechanisms, how the brain is forming. So how is the brain forming modules? How is the brain forming hubs? How is the brain folding? So if you look at the brain, it's highly folded. You have those gyri and sulci. And there was a chapter on there how we get this organization. And then finally, in the third part of the book, I discuss how the brain is developing in humans. So basically, how the brain changes for healthy development, how the brain changes for developmental disorders, how the brain changes for neurodegenerative disorders of old age, how the brain changes after brain injury, after a stroke, for example, how the brain changes through learning, and finally, how the brain can change through brain stimulation, because that's a very hot topic at the moment, using brain stimulation to treat mental health, because it could have better effects for mental health without having the strong side effects you currently have for pharmaceutical drug treatment.
Absolutely. And as some of the mental health professionals said, there are really different ways of addressing mental health conditions, and it's not just medication. There's also like a number of interventions, like what you've said. Now, I just want to delve into another aspect of what you do, Professor Kaiser. I understand you also run the Dynamic Connectome Lab. So tell us about your projects within your laboratory.
Yes. So the long-term goal is to help patients with psychiatric disorders and neurological disorders, and to basically replace pharmaceutical drugs. So to have alternative approaches how to treat patients. And the problem with pharmaceutical drugs is that they affect the whole brain. So once they go through the blood-brain barrier, they are not only acting on a brain region that is responsible for the disease, but they are acting on the whole brain. And this leads to side effects. So patients might even become more suicidal, or they might get depressed. So they might have other changes as a side effect of pharmaceutical interventions. So instead, I'm interested in interventions that are more focal, where only few parts of the network are targeted. And network analysis is a starting point. So we're analyzing brain networks. We find out which nodes, which regions of the network are affected, and we target those regions in order to improve cognition and processing in the brain. So in order to do that, we develop computer models of the immediate effect of brain stimulation, but also long-term effect. So if you stimulate someone, do you have any side effects weeks or months afterwards? So we really try to understand brain stimulation better through computational models. And I'm also currently setting up an experimental lab at Nottingham University using focused ultrasound to basically treat brain disorders. Focused ultrasound means that you send ultrasound sound waves through the brain, and they're basically all focusing in one part of the brain. So you can basically change brain activity in that part of the brain. And it's very promising because you can reach any part of the brain. It's not limited to regions that are very close to the skull. So basically, if you have magnetic or electrical stimulation, you can just target those regions that are relatively close to the skull. But with ultrasound, you can target deep brain structures. And we know that those deep brain structures are involved in many brain diseases, ranging from Parkinson's and Alzheimer's to schizophrenia and other mental disorders. So there's a huge opportunity to better target those diseases with better effects and fewer side effects.
Brilliant. So what I'll do is, for anyone who wants to get more involved or learn more about the projects that you do at the Dynamic Connectome Lab, I'll put the link on the video description notes so they can more learn about your projects. Now, of course, you're welcome. Now, of course, Professor Kaiser, you're also involved in science communication. I managed to see your YouTube channel, and you upload all sorts of contents, of course, relating to neuroinformatics and connectomics. But who is your target audience? Are you creating contents for future university students, or is it for researchers who are already interested within your discipline? And of course, do invite us out to do invite the listeners and the audience to your YouTube channel.
Yes, I mean, if you just search for Dynamic Connectome Lab on YouTube, you can find the channel. And basically, there's a mix of content. There are videos of talks that we give at international conferences. There were animations of how brains are connected, so the human brain, but also the small roundworm C. elegans, and other species, so basically how they are connected. There are also animations of how the brain is developing, so how a network is changing over time. There are animations about simulating a brain stimulation. And many of those videos just come together with journal articles. So you can click on a link to the journal article to find out more about the video that you're seeing. And in terms of my favorite video on there possibly is an animation of brain connectivity in a 4-year-old child. And basically, those are videos you don't normally see. So normally, if you think about brain connectivity, you see videos of adults, but very rarely you see videos of children. And it's interesting to see how different the connectivity looks at that stage. So you can see that there were a lot of changes still happening later on, and those changes can then explain how cognition is changing over time as well.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing to us your content and also the beauty of your discipline. Now, Professor Kaiser, you're also the chair of Neuroinformatics UK. So please tell us more about your organization. Do you have any upcoming events? And what's your membership structure like?
Yes. So basically, Neuroinformatics UK is representing 600 researchers who work in the fields of neuroinformatics and computational neuroscience in the UK. And we also represent neuroinformatics internationally. There is the International Neuroinformatics Coordinating Facility, INCF, and we are representing the UK within that organization. We are basically split up into 3 special interest groups. One is linked to the British Neuroscience Association, looking at applications in experimental neuroscience. One is linked to the NHS, looking at clinical applications of neuroinformatics. And one is linked to applications in artificial intelligence, deep learning, and neuromorphic computing. So basically, there's a wide range of areas that we are covering. And people can join us. They can join a mailing list. They can follow us on Twitter. And they can find out more about events online.
Brilliant.
And basically, the address is neuroinformatics.org.uk.
Okay, I'll also put that on the video description note. Now, clearly the field of neuroinformatics is really an exciting field. It's very dynamic, and as you've demonstrated, there are a number of real life applications to your field. Now, my question to you, Professor Kaiser, is what are the key challenges that has to be overcome in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, one challenge that the whole field faces is that the models we have about the brain always change over time. So if we go back to the 50s and 60s, people thought that the brain is like a computer system, right? So you have input, you have processing, you have output. And we know that this is not the case. So a lot of the information comes from memory rather from input. If we think about the visual system, we only see 2% of the outside world at any point in time. So that's basically the focus of our gaze where we're looking at. And the other 98% are filled in from memory. And you can basically test that. You can put a subject in front of a screen and you measure where the subject is looking at when reading a text. And you just flip around the whole text that the subject is not looking on. And the subject will not notice. So the subject looks at individual words, so those are the 2%, and the other 98% of the words are just flipped around upside down, and the subject will not see that, because all that information comes from memory and not from the eye. So nowadays, the idea is that you have a lot of internal prediction of how the external world is functioning. So a lot of our processing is coming from memory and from internal predictions how the world is functioning. And this has led to ideas proposed by Carl Friston, like the free energy principle. And one challenge is to really intuitively get an understanding of those theories, because they become a bit complicated. And it's in a similar way, if you think about computationally representing brains, let's say with machine learning or deep learning, again, you have systems that are becoming better at representing the brain. They're still not good in terms of combining different kinds of information. So you might have one deep learning algorithm for image recognition, but it's not coupled to recognition of sound or voices, for example. So this whole integration part is not very well developed in artificial neural networks.
Absolutely.
So those systems are getting better, but it becomes very complicated to understand what is going on in those systems. So my worry is that in 5 to 10 years, we might say we have an idea how the brain works, but we have no idea how to communicate it, because our theories become very complicated. So I think that's one big challenge in the field.
And of course, I would imagine that a lot of researchers in your area would really be involved in addressing those challenges. Now, earlier, Professor Kaiser, you were talking about new treatment options that you've discovered about epilepsy. Now, can you also mention any other emerging trends in neuroinformatics that you're excited about?
Yeah. So basically, there are some applications. One application is to predict personality traits based on brain connectivity. So to have a much closer link between how the network is organized and the cognition of a human subject. So that's interesting, because we can be a lot more fine-tuned in terms of treatment as well. So we might want to target a specific disease, but we want to avoid side effects that affect certain parts of cognition. And basically having a better understanding of how the brain network is linked to cognition is really crucial to avoid those side effects, but also to think about beneficial effects that we want to achieve. Another part is to use brain connectivity in detail to predict intervention effects. I think that is the next step. There are now 2 software packages out there looking at brain connectivity in clinical settings. So one is developed by collaborators Biomax and in Germany called NeurXM. It's basically a workflow where you can use MRI images from the hospital. You can analyze the data automatically. You can reconstruct brain connectivity, and you can then use simulations and data analysis to inform diagnosis and also to inform treatment. So I think those are really the next steps, that brain connectivity will become a standard in the hospital, that you not only look at a structural MRI, which tells you about changes in gray matter and white matter, or some fMRI to look at activity, but you basically get information about brain connectivity as well in order to plan treatment in individual patients. It's still a few years down the line, but it's basically early stages, and you can see that this change will come in the next couple of years. And finally, one challenge is to change connectivity rather than activity. So over the last 20 years, we have learned that brain connectivity is changing for different brain diseases. And one opportunity is to change connectivity back to normal. And we can do that with brain stimulation. There was one study by colleagues at Shanghai Jiao Tong University in the functional neurosurgery unit, where they look at deep brain stimulation and they look at connectivity changes after deep brain stimulation. And the more the connectivity goes back to what you see in a healthy subject, the better the improvement in the patient. So you can see this clear link of connectivity changes and cognitive improvements. And this is something that would be very useful in the future to understand.
Absolutely. And of course, I also have to ask you what you're most hopeful and excited about the future of Connectomics. And did you also cover this with your new book?
Yes. So basically, in the book, I'm really advocating for a better understanding of brain connectivity and using that for interventions in mental health. And my future hope is really that rather than going to hospital and coming back with a small packet of pharmaceutical drugs to take regularly, we basically in the future have patients coming to the hospital with an evaluation of their history, what could be the underlying reason to get certain symptoms, then having an MRI scan, including scans for structural and functional connectivity, and then having a personalized treatment that is really different for each individual patient, where we can maximize the beneficial effect, targeting one or very few brain regions and minimizing any negative side effects. So the idea is really to have personalized interventions, and both invasive and non-invasive brain stimulation can be a key to achieve this.
Absolutely. And Professor Kaiser, on a less scientific question, who inspires you both professionally and personally?
Well, it's hard to think about one person. So basically, there were people with whom I worked during my career that inspire me. So, for example, supervisors of my work, Klaus Hilgetag, my PhD supervisor, other people in the field like Carl Friston. So there are many people out there that inspire me.
And how do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
Well, if I have time, which is not as much as I would like, I play. Well, I try to learn more piano playing, so that's one long-term goal. And that's basically one relaxation, and of course, watching movies, listening to music.
I was expecting that you would say playing computer games.
Not that much, really. No.
Okay. And what's the most important thing you want people to know about you and the work that you do? What's the big message from Professor Marcus Kaiser?
Yes. I mean, the big message is not to be afraid of moving into new areas. So basically, I think the most opportunities for novel discoveries are really between disciplines. And sometimes people are hesitant to get outside their discipline. So, for example, if they study physics or computer science, they might be a bit hesitant to really reach out to clinicians or to biomedical researchers. And I would really encourage people to make this step. It does take a bit longer, possibly, than just staying into your discipline, but it's very rewarding because you can think about real-world applications of your theories. So rather than just downloading some data set online and doing some analysis and publishing it, it's very rewarding to really work with researchers and getting towards translation of your findings, and on the long term seeing that this can really be used to inform diagnosis and treatment. And I would also encourage students to study outside their area. So if you study psychology, just have a look what lectures are there in mathematics, in computer science, in medicine. Just try to broaden your background. And this is the case for actually many researchers in the area. So I know several colleagues who studied 2 subjects at university, or like in my case, they took computer science modules at a distance university alongside their main studies to learn more about different areas. So I would really encourage that, especially if you're interested in an academic career.
That's a very helpful message. It actually resonates to me because my interest oscillates between arts and positive psychology, and I tried to, when I did my PhD, I struggled to look for an area where I could really put them together, arts and blogging about positive psychology. But like what you've said, it's really helpful if you could broaden your interest, so you could actually find ways to collaborate with other people. And like what you've said, there's already a trend now, I suppose, that we're heading towards the direction of interdisciplinary collaboration. And as what you've demonstrated between the field of computer science and psychology, there's a lot of things, and there's a lot of things that we could actually work together. And it really brings a lot of output that really helps whatever discipline you're working on. Yes. Now, for anyone who's interested to learn more about neuroinformatics or connectomics, can you recommend sources or events or books other than your books, of course?
Yeah. So you can basically download some of my lectures on my website. So you can have a look at the slides there. There was a master degree in Nottingham where you can learn more about cognitive sciences, artificial intelligence, and computational models of the brain. You can look at the INCF website. They have many talks online that you can listen to. You can join mailing lists, the connection list mailing list, the Neuro mailing lists, where you can learn more about job opportunities, training opportunities, novel research in the area. So there's several opportunities to learn more about the field. And I think it's a really open field and emerging field, and it's becoming more important in the future because the data sets in neuroscience and psychology get larger and larger. So you need more and more computational skills to deal with the data and to analyze the data. And if I look back at the master degrees that I was teaching in the past and teaching now, basically 2/3 of the students come from psychology, biology, or medicine. And basically they train with those computational methods. So it can be really rewarding to learn more about those techniques, to learn more about networks and complex systems, and to be better able to work in those areas. And of those who graduated, most of them continue with a PhD, and then they continue with research in academia or industry. And there was a huge demand in industry as well. If you think about neuromorphic computing, there are many companies working on that, IBM, for example, many other companies trying to produce hardware. And for that, it's really important to know how the brain is organized to get a better understanding how you should design the hardware. And there are also many applications in terms of machine learning and deep learning in industry. And I'm on the scientific advisory board of one company, BrainGrade, that is developing brain stimulation techniques. And again, it's important for jobs in the company to have an understanding both of how the brain is organized, but also an understanding of the computational aspects.
And I just like to touch upon what you said about mailing lists. And sometimes we don't really, tend to acknowledge the importance of mailing lists. We just focus on social media and YouTube. But actually, I could attest that a lot of the connections that I've made are actually from mailing lists. And I'm quite sure that for whatever discipline that that you're into, you could always find a mailing list. And it's really helpful if you could network with other people.
Yes. Now, I can give one example for the mailing list. I mean, during my PhD, I looked at connectivity in the roundworm C. elegans. And there was one book describing the connectivity. And in that book, there were 150 pages of tables describing the connectivity. And of course, I didn't want to type in those 150 pages. So there was a 5/4 inch floppy disk in the back of the book where all the connectivity was saved as a data file. So after a few weeks, I found someone in the computer center of the university who had an old 5/4-inch floppy disk. So we put the floppy disk in, and it couldn't read anymore. So basically, after 10, 20 years, the magnetic information is not very good on floppy disks. So unfortunately, we couldn't read the data file. And then I was sending an email on a mailing list asking, does anyone have the data file from that book? And thankfully, someone had the data file and was sending me the data back by email. Otherwise, there were many papers that I wouldn't have been able to publish without getting their data over the mailing list.
Absolutely. So the magic of mailing lists.
Yes.
Take it from Professor Marcus Kaiser. But what is your professional dream?
My professional dream is to have a real clinical impact on the long term. So to have patients that come to the hospital and have alternative treatments for mental disorders, and they don't suffer those side effects anymore. So I know from patients with schizophrenia, for example, that take pharmaceutical drugs, and those drugs help with avoiding psychosis. So you basically don't have hallucinations anymore. But you also have huge side effects that you have lower energy, you're not well motivated anymore to perform tasks. You are very unlikely to basically have a regular job because of that. So if we can basically have treatments that can avoid hallucinations, but at the same time, you don't have a lack of energy, so people can have jobs and can continue education and so on, that would be a tremendous improvement in the field. And this is something I hope to achieve in the future.
Well, what about getting involved in developing an app? Do you fancy getting involved with that?
You mean like a smartphone app, or?
Yeah, a smartphone
Yes,
app.
yes. One of my PhD students was developing an app for epilepsy patients. But basically, that app was for diagnosis, so finding out about excitability in the brain. And I had some master students who developed apps for different ideas, so not with applications for mental health, but some other ideas that might be useful. So I'm a little bit involved in app development, but I wouldn't say it's my main focus.
Absolutely. And what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a professor?
I was, during my PhD, I was thinking about different options, and I also contacted representatives from companies. So I was wondering whether it would be an option to go to a company and do research there. So I always knew that I wanted to do research and find out something new. And it was well, I don't want to say the name, but a very large electronics company. And the people in the company were telling me, well, you better go to academia if you're interested in research. So what happened in industry, and it didn't only happen in Germany, but all over the world, is that basic research got reduced. So if you think about the olden days with Bell Labs, then Lucid Technologies and so on, and other companies, you had a lot of basic research going on in those companies, and the amount of basic research has been drastically reduced. So nowadays, if you go to industry and you want to work on neural networks, you basically get certain tasks to do. So basically develop a system for collision avoidance for cars, for example. So you have very specific tasks that you have to work on, and you're not able to work on your own ideas and find out novel things. And this was the reason why I decided to stay in academia and to aim for an academic career rather than going to industry. So I would say if you have your own ideas, what you want to do, it's better to stay in academia. If you're happy someone else telling you what to do and what to work on and what to research, then industry is a very good option. And basically, graduates from my lab went to industry. So one started a company in Silicon Valley, one worked for IBM in the UK. So nothing against industry, but it's just depending on your own motivation or what you want to achieve.
So that actually reminds me of what I used to hear from one of my lecturers when I was at university, that they say that those who teach, those who can teach, they go to academia, but they can't practice. And if you can practice but you cannot teach, you go to industry. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, not necessarily. It's just it's more like if you have a vision what you want to research, then it's better in academia. If you're more enjoying the process of researching rather than the topic of what you're researching, then it's better to go to industry.
And finally, Dr. Professor Marcus Meyer, what else is in the pipeline? And if people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at? And of course, refresh our memory again. Where is your book available? Can we get it on Amazon? And what bookshops is it available?
Yes. So the book, I'm just holding the camera, is available on Amazon and with all other major booksellers. And if you want to get in touch, you can just go to my website. You can send me an email. I think email is maybe the best way to get in touch. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter, Connectome Lab. And you can follow me on YouTube, connect on LinkedIn. So many different ways to get in contact. But if you have any specific questions, you can just email.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Marcus Meyer, it's a pleasure having you here on the VRH show, but unfortunately our time is up. I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Okay, thanks very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.